For 7 months, a millionaire paid his maid to be his wife, but he never expected this twist. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to the main character. Alexander Cole had never believed in grand gestures or emotional promises. To him, everything had a structure, a timeline, and a price. And that belief had carried him from a cramped college apartment to a glass and steel penthouse overlooking the city skyline. At 39, Alexander was a self-made millionaire, the kind whose name appeared quietly on business pages and never on gossip columns. A man known for control, precision, and an almost surgical detachment from personal attachments. That detachment was exactly why the letter from his family's legal firm unsettled him more than any hostile takeover ever had, because it did not threaten his money but his authority, stating plainly that without a stable public marriage, his position as sole decision-maker in the family trust would be reviewed within the year. Alexander did the math in seconds, calculating risk the way he always did, and arrived at a solution that felt efficient, clean, and entirely emotionless. Claire Bennett was scrubbing the marble floor of the West Wing when he noticed her, not because she was loud or careless, but because she worked with a quiet intensity that suggested pride rather than obligation, her movement steady, her eyes focused, her presence almost invisible yet impossible to ignore once seen. Claire was 28, white, soft-spoken, and carried herself with a restraint shaped by years of choosing dignity, even when life offered very little comfort in return. When Alexander called her into his office that evening, she stood straight with her hands folded, prepared for criticism or dismissal, unaware that her life was about to pivot in a way she could never have imagined. He did not waste time with pleasantries, sliding a folder across the desk, his voice calm, measured, professional, explaining that he needed a wife for 7 months. Only in public, only. On paper, with clear boundaries and generous compensation that could cover medical bills, housing stability, and a future she had quietly stopped planning for herself. Claire listened without interrupting, her face composed even as her heart raced, because nothing in her upbringing had prepared her for a proposal framed as a transaction rather than a promise. She asked practical questions about expectations, appearances, and privacy, not about romance, not about feelings, because those were luxuries neither of them seemed to be offering. When Alexander stated the final condition, no emotional involvement, no claims beyond the contract, Claire felt an unexpected calm settle over her, as if the clarity itself was a kind of mercy. She signed not because she dreamed of becoming his wife, but because she understood survival, responsibility, and the weight of time, and as Alexander countersigned, neither of them noticed that something intangible had already shifted in the room, subtle and quiet, like the first crack in ice before it gives way. The contract changed everything without changing anything at all, at least on the surface, because the next morning Claire Bennett still woke before sunrise, still tied her hair back with the same elastic band, and still moved quietly through the penthouse, as if she belonged to the walls rather than the life unfolding inside them. The difference was invisible to the staff, but heavy in her chest, because now every step she took echoed with a new label she was not allowed to feel: wife, a word that existed only in public spaces and legal documents, never in private moments. Alexander Cole noticed the shift immediately, not because she acted differently, but because the air around her felt altered, more deliberate, more guarded, and it irritated him in a way he did not bother to analyze. He had outlined the terms clearly: 7 months, appearances only, no emotional obligations, no interference with each other's personal lives, and generous compensation paid bi-weekly like clockwork. Yet he found himself watching her longer than necessary as she reviewed the schedule he had prepared for their first public appearance. The announcement was scheduled for the following Friday at a charity board luncheon downtown, a controlled environment filled with familiar faces who would ask polite questions and smile for photographs, and Claire practiced the role in her head the way she had learned to practice everything else in life, quietly, thoroughly, without expecting applause. She learned quickly how to stand beside him without shrinking, how to place her hand on his arm when cameras appeared, how to smile without revealing too much, because survival had taught her that visibility was a skill, not a gift. Alexander, for his part, approached the arrangement like any other strategic maneuver, mapping risks, rehearsing statements, and instructing his legal team to manage the narrative. Yet something unsettled him when he realized he did not need to correct Claire even once. She adapted seamlessly, not because she wanted his approval, but because she respected herself enough to do the job well, and that distinction lodged itself somewhere uncomfortable in his mind. Outside the penthouse, their lives remained sharply divided. Alexander navigating boardrooms and conference calls measured in millions of dollars and quarterly projections. Claire checking her phone during breaks to track her mother's appointments and prescription refills, calculating gas mileage and grocery costs down to the dollar, grateful for the financial relief, but painfully aware that it came with an expiration date. At night, the apartment grew quiet, not awkward but intentionally distant, with separate bedrooms and unspoken rules that held as firmly as any clause in the contract. Yet Alexander found that the silence felt different now, less empty and more expectant, as if something waited just beyond the edges of his control. He told himself it was a temporary adjustment, a side effect of shared space. But when he heard Claire coughing softly one evening in the kitchen and instinctively paused his call to ask if she was all right, the question lingered longer than he liked. Claire answered politely, thanked him, and returned to her tasks, unaware that the simple exchange had unsettled him more than any confrontation ever had. The stakes were clear to both of them, even if neither spoke them aloud, because for Alexander this marriage was a shield, a way to protect his authority and keep his company intact, while for Claire it was a bridge, fragile and time-bound, leading her family away from immediate crisis but toward an uncertain future. Neither believed in fairy tales, neither expected miracles, and both entered the arrangement with eyes open. Yet as the days moved closer to that first public appearance, the distance between what was written on paper and what was unfolding in real time began to narrow, quietly, persistently, setting the stage for choices neither had planned to make. The first public appearance arrived faster than either of them expected, unfolding on a clear Friday morning when the city streets glimmered after an early rain and the charity board luncheon buzzed with polite conversation and restrained curiosity. Claire stood in front of the bedroom mirror adjusting the simple navy dress Alexander's assistant had selected, the fabric clean and understated, elegant without drawing attention, and she reminded herself that this was not a transformation but a role, one she had agreed to play with composure and restraint. Alexander waited near the door, reviewing messages on his phone, yet his attention drifted when she stepped beside him, not because of how she looked, but because of how naturally she carried herself, calm and centered, as if she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. During the drive downtown, they reviewed names, talking points, and expected questions, the conversation efficient and professional, but beneath the surface Claire cataloged small details without trying. The way Alexander loosened his tie when tense, the way his jaw tightened when he anticipated confrontation, the way silence seemed to press in on him more heavily than noise ever did. At the luncheon, everything unfolded exactly as planned. Introductions made, hands shaken, photographs taken, and Claire discovered that standing beside Alexander felt less like performing and more like anchoring, her presence steadying him in ways he had not predicted. When a board member asked how they met, Alexander delivered the rehearsed response, but Claire noticed the brief pause before he spoke, as if he considered telling the truth and dismissed it just as quickly, and something in her softened without her permission. Throughout the afternoon, she adapted seamlessly, laughing at appropriate moments, listening attentively, and offering thoughtful responses that surprised more than one executive who had expected a silent accessory rather than a partner with quiet insight. Alexander observed these reactions with growing awareness, recognizing that Claire was not simply filling space but altering perceptions, humanizing him in ways years of public relations strategy never had. Later that evening, back at the penthouse, the tension of the day lingered in the air, not uncomfortable but charged with unspoken acknowledgement, and when Alexander thanked her for handling everything so well, the sincerity in his voice caught both of them off guard. Over the following weeks, routines formed that neither had anticipated, shared breakfasts dictated by overlapping schedules, brief exchanges in the hallway that stretched into meaningful conversations, and small adjustments made without discussion, like Alexander ensuring there was always almond milk in the refrigerator because he noticed Claire avoided dairy. Claire, in turn, learned the rhythm of his days, the late nights filled with quiet concentration, the early mornings spent reviewing market data, and she found herself leaving a fresh cup of coffee on his desk without comment, not as a duty, but as an instinctive gesture of care. These details accumulated slowly, becoming the invisible threads that bound their days together. And although the contract remained untouched in its folder, its presence felt less definitive with each passing moment. Claire continued to manage her personal responsibilities with careful precision, using part of her compensation to stabilize her mother's care and quietly setting aside the rest, fully aware that this arrangement would end and that she would need to stand on her own again. Alexander, meanwhile, began to notice the subtle ways his home had changed, not in decor or routine, but in atmosphere, as if the space itself responded to her presence, warmer, less imposing, more human. He told himself these observations were irrelevant, side effects of proximity rather than emotion. Yet when he found himself returning home earlier than necessary just to share dinner, he realized that the boundaries he had so carefully defined were already blurring. Neither spoke of these shifts aloud, because acknowledging them would require renegotiating terms neither was ready to revisit. But as the weeks turned into months, it became increasingly clear that what they were building within the quiet confines of shared space was something no contract could fully contain. Time moved differently once the arrangement settled into their bones, the days blending into weeks, and the weeks quietly stacking into months, until the number 7 no longer felt abstract but lived in the background of every choice they made. Public appearances became routine, not because they rehearsed them endlessly, but because they learned how to read each other in real time, how a slight shift of Claire's posture signaled discomfort, how Alexander's brief silence meant he was calculating rather than disengaged, and how standing close no longer felt like a performance, but a shared language understood without explanation. They attended galas, fundraisers, and private dinners where people watched them with interest, some with admiration and others with thinly veiled skepticism. Yet Claire never faltered, meeting each gaze with quiet confidence, answering questions thoughtfully, and deflecting assumptions with grace that could not be taught. Alexander began to notice how people responded differently to him when she was present, how conversations softened, how criticism eased, how trust formed faster, and although he told himself it was optics, he could not ignore the subtle pride that surfaced when others complimented his wife's intelligence rather than her appearance. At home, the penthouse evolved into something that resembled a lived space rather than a showcase, with shared dinners replacing silent evenings, casual conversations unfolding over the kitchen island, and laughter appearing unexpectedly, startling both of them before settling comfortably into the air. Claire stopped tiptoeing around the apartment, and Alexander stopped retreating behind closed doors, not because the contract demanded it, but because the space felt incomplete without the other moving through it. Small traditions formed without discussion, Sunday mornings spent reviewing news articles together, late-night takeout when work ran long, quiet walks around the neighborhood where no one recognized them and no one expected anything, moments where the weight of public perception lifted just enough for them to breathe. Claire noticed Alexander's tension ease during these walks, his shoulders relaxing, his voice losing its edge, and she wondered when she had become someone capable of offering that relief. Alexander, in turn, observed Claire's strength in ways that surprised him, how she navigated difficult conversations with empathy rather than avoidance, how she listened fully before speaking, and how she never used his wealth as leverage, even when it could have made her life easier. The lines between maid, wife, and partner blurred steadily, though neither named the shift, because naming it would require confronting what lay beneath, and neither felt ready to risk destabilizing what had become unexpectedly precious. The 7-month timeline ticked forward relentlessly, marked by calendar alerts and legal reminders that Alexander dismissed without comment but never deleted, while Claire quietly counted the weeks, adjusting her savings, preparing herself for the inevitable end with the same discipline she had always relied on. Yet despite the looming expiration, moments of genuine connection multiplied, late-night conversations stretching longer than intended, shared glances across crowded rooms that spoke of understanding rather than obligation, and silences that felt companionable rather than empty. Alexander began to recognize a discomfort he could not rationalize, a sense of unease when he imagined the apartment without her presence, when he pictured events without her calm assurance at his side, and when he realized that his success felt less hollow with someone to share it. Claire sensed the shift as well, though she guarded her heart carefully, reminding herself that contracts ended and roles dissolved, and that she had survived worse than a temporary arrangement, even as she found herself lingering in shared moments, memorizing details she told herself she would one day need to forget. By the time the 5th month arrived, neither could claim ignorance of what was happening, because what they shared no longer fit neatly within the boundaries they had drawn, yet both continued forward, bound by routine, by unspoken trust, and by a growing awareness that the arrangement designed to protect them might ultimately be the very thing that forced them to confront the truth they were both avoiding. The 5th month brought the evening that would quietly change everything, unfolding at a high-profile donor reception held in a restored historic hotel where chandeliers glowed warm against polished wood and reputations mattered as much as balance sheets. Claire stood beside Alexander as they entered, her posture relaxed yet attentive, fully aware that this room held people who measured worth in titles and family names, people who believed they could identify belonging at a glance. Conversations flowed easily at first, familiar faces offering congratulations and polite curiosity, and Alexander navigated the room with practiced ease, until a small group near the bar shifted the tone. One of the donors, a woman known for her bluntness and inherited influence, glanced at Claire with a smile that did not reach her eyes and asked, loudly enough for others to hear, how Alexander had met someone so devoted, her emphasis thinly veiled. Before Alexander could respond, another voice chimed in with a laugh, suggesting that loyalty was easy to buy these days if one knew where to look, and the implications settled over the group like a challenge. The moment stretched, subtle yet sharp, and Alexander felt the familiar instinct to control the narrative, to intervene, to redirect, but before he could speak, Claire did something neither of them had anticipated. She met the woman's gaze calmly and smiled, not defensively, not sweetly, but with quiet assurance, and she spoke with a steady clarity that drew attention without raising her voice. She said that commitment was not something that could be purchased, that showing up for someone required intention, patience, and respect, and that she was proud of the life she shared with her husband because it was built on trust rather than spectacle. The room stilled just enough for her words to land, and the donor faltered, offering a vague apology that did nothing to reclaim her authority. Alexander watched the exchange with ale astonishment, realizing that Claire had not defended herself alone, but had defended him as well, not by invoking wealth or status, but by reframing the entire conversation around values he rarely articulated. As the group dispersed, whispers followed them, some curious, some impressed, and Alexander felt an unfamiliar warmth rise beneath his composure, a surge of respect that had nothing to do with optics. Later that evening, on the drive home, the silence between them felt charged rather than empty, and Alexander broke it with a quiet thank you that carried more weight than any formal acknowledgement he had offered before. Claire shrugged it off gently, saying only that she would not allow anyone to reduce either of them to a transaction, and her words lingered long after the city lights blurred past the windows. At home, the penthouse felt different, less like a temporary stage and more like a shared refuge, and as they moved through the familiar routine of ending the night, Alexander found himself pausing, struggling to articulate something that had shifted irreversibly. He realized then that the boundaries he had designed so carefully had not protected him from attachment, but had instead given him a false sense of control, because Claire had just chosen him in a room full of people who could have offered her more power, more security, and more influence. Claire, retreating to her room later, pressed her hand briefly to her chest, acknowledging the tremor she had kept hidden, aware that standing up had felt natural in the moment, but dangerous in its aftermath, because it revealed how deeply she cared. Neither slept easily that night, both replaying the evening from different angles, both recognizing that something essential had been exposed, something that could not be unseen. The contract still existed, The timeline still advanced, but the illusion of emotional distance fractured quietly, leaving behind a truth neither of them could ignore, that what had begun as an arrangement had crossed into something far more consequential, and that the choice Claire made in that room would echo through every decision that followed. As the 6th month began, the timeline they had both avoided acknowledging moved to the forefront of every quiet moment, no longer an abstract concept, but a concrete reality marked by calendar notifications and legal reminders that Alexander could no longer ignore. The contract sat untouched in his office drawer, yet its presence felt heavier than ever, because each passing day brought them closer to an ending neither had planned for emotionally, even if they had agreed to it intellectually. Alexander found himself distracted during meetings, his thoughts drifting not to profit margins or negotiations, but to the subtle changes he noticed at home. The way Claire moved more carefully now, as if already preparing to step back, as if rehearsing absence before it became necessary. Claire felt the same tension tightening beneath her calm exterior, because while she continued to fulfill her role flawlessly in public, she had begun quietly organizing her life beyond the penthouse, updating her resume, researching modest apartments within commuting distance of her mother's care facility, and setting reminders to cancel services she would no longer need once the arrangement ended. Neither spoke of these preparations aloud, yet the awareness of them hung between them, altering the rhythm they had grown accustomed to. Conversations shortened, not from conflict, but from restraint, both choosing silence rather than risk saying something that could not be taken back. Alexander noticed how often he caught himself wanting to reach for her reassurance, to ask her opinion, to share a thought that had nothing to do with business, and how often he stopped himself at the last moment, reminding himself that dependence was not part of the agreement. Claire sensed his hesitation as well, recognizing the conflict in his posture, the way his gaze lingered before he looked away, and she told herself that the distance was necessary, that learning to detach now would make the transition easier later. Yet the effort to pull back only highlighted how deeply intertwined their lives had become, because absence, even imagined, carried a weight she had not anticipated. One evening, as they reviewed upcoming appearances together, Alexander mentioned casually that there were only a few events left before the contract expired, his tone neutral but his grip on the pen too tight, and Claire responded with professional agreement, though her chest tightened at the sound of the words. The acknowledgement lingered between them, unspoken questions rising and falling without resolution, because neither knew how to ask for more without risking everything. That night, Alexander lay awake long after the city quieted, staring at the ceiling as he replayed the past months with uncomfortable clarity, realizing that Claire had become the one person who saw him without expectation or entitlement, who offered presence rather than pressure, and the thought of returning to a life without that grounding filled him with an unease he could no longer rationalize away. Claire, awake in her own room, faced a different reckoning, recognizing that what she felt for Alexander had grown beyond respect or gratitude into something far more vulnerable, something she had not planned for and did not know how to protect herself from once the structure of the arrangement disappeared. The next day, Alexander attempted to bury himself in work, scheduling meetings back to back, extending his hours, and avoiding the quiet spaces where reflection crept in. But even productivity could not drown out the sense that he was approaching a decision point with no clear solution. Claire noticed his absence and filled the space with practical tasks, reminding herself that stability came from self-reliance, not attachment, even as she felt the loss of shared routines more acutely with each passing day. By the end of the week, the tension had become impossible to ignore, manifesting in missed cues and unfinished conversations. And when Alexander finally remarked that things felt different lately, Claire met his gaze steadily and said only that change was inevitable, her voice calm even as her heart raced. The exchange left them both unsettled, because it acknowledged the truth without offering comfort. And as the days continued to count down toward the contract's end, both realized that the greatest risk they faced was no longer public perception or financial consequence, but the possibility of walking away from something real simply because it had never been part of the original plan. The truth surfaced quietly, not through confrontation or accusation, but through a routine briefing Alexander almost postponed, a late afternoon meeting with his legal counsel to review final arrangements before the contract expired. As documents were discussed and timelines confirmed, one detail caught his attention: a declined offer logged weeks earlier from a rival consortium attempting to leverage insider insight during a sensitive negotiation. The refusal was noted without explanation, categorized as a closed inquiry, yet something about the timing unsettled him, because it aligned precisely with a period when Claire had been alone at home while he traveled for meetings. When he asked for clarification, his counsel hesitated, then explained that the offer had been made directly to Claire, framed as a consulting opportunity with substantial compensation and long-term security, contingent upon sharing observations that could have shifted leverage against Alexander's position. The room seemed to narrow as the implications settled, because the amount mentioned exceeded what Alexander himself had paid her over the entire 7 months, and yet she had declined it without discussion, without disclosure, and without attempting to renegotiate her own arrangement. Alexander ended the meeting abruptly, his thoughts racing, replaying conversations, gestures, and moments of quiet integrity he had taken for granted. He drove home in silence, the city passing in a blur, realizing that Claire had protected him without obligation, without contract, and without expectation of reward, choosing loyalty at a moment when she could have secured her future with a single decision. At the penthouse, he found her in the kitchen, calmly preparing dinner as if the day carried no hidden weight, and the contrast between her composed presence and the revelation he carried made his chest tighten. He asked her directly, not accusingly but carefully, whether anyone had approached her during his absence, and for a moment she considered deflecting, then chose honesty with the same quiet strength she brought to everything else. She explained that the offer had been made, that it promised comfort and independence, and that she had refused because she would not undermine someone she respected, especially not under the guise of opportunity. She spoke without drama, without self-congratulation, simply stating facts, yet each word dismantled the assumptions Alexander had built his life upon. He realized then that Claire's integrity had never been conditional, that her loyalty did not stem from payment or obligation, but from a moral compass that remained steady regardless of circumstance. The weight of that realization pressed heavily upon him, because it reframed every boundary he had drawn, every safeguard he had relied on to avoid vulnerability. Claire watched his reaction carefully, prepared for disappointment or detachment, but instead saw something else emerge, a mixture of gratitude, admiration, and regret that he struggled to articulate. Alexander admitted that he had never expected such a choice, that he had structured their arrangement around control rather than trust, and that her decision forced him to confront how little faith he had placed in genuine character. The conversation stretched into the evening, not heated but intense, each exchange peeling back layers of guarded understanding, until both acknowledged what had remained unspoken for months, that the arrangement had evolved into something neither could dismiss as temporary. Yet the truth carried its own complication, because it arrived too close to the contract's end to be ignored, raising questions neither had answers to. Claire confessed that she had planned to leave quietly when the time came, believing that what they shared could not survive outside the structure that created it, and Alexander admitted that the thought of her departure unsettled him more than any professional risk ever had. The revelation shifted the balance between them irrevocably, because it exposed the depth of Claire's commitment and the fragility of Alexander's carefully managed detachment, leaving both at a crossroads they had not anticipated. As the night settled and the city lights flickered beyond the windows, Alexander understood that the greatest twist was not that Claire had protected him, but that she had done so freely, without contract or compensation, forcing him to consider whether he was willing to risk everything he had built to choose her in return. The morning after the truth came out, the penthouse felt suspended in time, as if the walls themselves were waiting for a decision neither of them had yet voiced. Alexander rose before dawn, the city still quiet beneath a pale sky, and stood alone in his office holding the contract he had treated as an anchor for 7 months. The paper felt thinner than he remembered, the words less definitive now that he understood how little control they had actually given him. When Claire appeared in the doorway, already dressed to leave for the day, he asked her to sit, his voice steady but stripped of its usual authority. She did, folding her hands in her lap, prepared for a formal conversation that would close a chapter she had already begun to mourn. Alexander did not speak immediately, because for the first time in his life, calculation failed him, and he realized that whatever came next could not be negotiated. He told her that he had reviewed everything, that he understood the magnitude of the choice she had made, and that he could no longer pretend their relationship was defined by a document. Then, without ceremony, he tore the contract in half, the sound quiet but final, and placed the pieces on the desk between them. Claire stared at the torn pages, her breath catching, because she had braced herself for an ending, not an unraveling of the only structure that had kept her feelings contained. Alexander explained that he would honor every financial commitment already made, that nothing she relied on would be taken from her, but that he could not ask her to remain under false pretenses, not after learning the depth of her integrity. He admitted that he had hidden behind terms and timelines because they allowed him to feel safe, because they protected him from wanting something he could not control, and he acknowledged that she had shown him what real commitment looked like without ever demanding it in return. Claire listened in silence, her emotions colliding beneath her composed exterior, because the contract had been both shield and boundary, and without it, she felt exposed in ways she did not know how to navigate. She asked him what he wanted now, not as a businessman but as a man, and the question lingered between them, heavy with risk. Alexander answered honestly, saying that he wanted her to stay, not as an employee, not as a public solution, but as someone who chose him freely, fully aware that she could walk away without consequence. He told her that if she needed time or space, he would respect it, because choosing her meant relinquishing the control he had relied on for so long. Claire stood slowly, pacing the room as she absorbed his words, her mind racing through practical concerns she had learned never to ignore: independence, security, the cost of vulnerability, and the fear of losing herself in someone else's world. She confessed that she had fallen into this arrangement believing she could keep her heart separate, that she had told herself affection was manageable as long as it was temporary, and that she had prepared to leave quietly because she did not trust promises without structure. Alexander acknowledged that fear, admitting that his wealth had always complicated trust, blurring the line between genuine connection and convenience, and that he understood why she would hesitate to believe him now. The conversation unfolded without raised voices or dramatic declarations, grounded instead in mutual respect and cautious honesty, until Claire finally met his gaze and spoke with a clarity that surprised even her. She said that she would not stay out of obligation or gratitude, that she needed to choose him for herself or not at all, and that doing so required stepping into uncertainty without guarantees. Alexander accepted that condition without hesitation, recognizing that love, if it was to mean anything, demanded risk rather than assurance. As the morning light brightened the room, Claire made her decision, not impulsively but deliberately, choosing to remain, not because the contract bound her, but because she believed in the man Alexander was becoming when he let go of control. The choice reshaped everything between them, because it transformed their relationship from an arrangement into a commitment grounded in mutual consent, and as they stood together in the quiet aftermath, both understood that what they had chosen was not safety, but something far more powerful: the courage to build a future without terms. The weeks that followed unfolded without spectacle, but with a quiet certainty that neither of them had known before, because once the contract was gone, every choice they made carried a different weight. Claire no longer measured her days against an expiration date, and Alexander no longer framed his future in terms of contingency plans. Yet both approached this new chapter with care, aware that trust was built through consistency rather than grand declarations. Their public appearances continued, but the difference was subtle and profound: a shared ease that could not be rehearsed, a warmth that replaced precision, and people noticed, not because of staged affection, but because authenticity has a way of revealing itself. At home, the penthouse became something neither of them had anticipated, not a symbol of success or a temporary shelter, but a place where routines reflected mutual consideration rather than obligation. Claire rearranged the space slowly, not to claim it, but to make it livable, adding small touches that reflected shared preferences rather than hierarchy. And Alexander found himself welcoming the change, realizing that control had never brought him the sense of belonging he felt. Now, Conversations deepened naturally, touching on fears, aspirations, and histories they had once avoided, and with each exchange, the distance between who they had been and who they were becoming narrowed. Alexander learned to listen without strategizing, to offer support without solutions, and Claire learned that reliance did not diminish her strength, that choosing partnership did not erase independence. Their relationship did not erase the differences in their backgrounds, but it reframed them, transforming contrast into complement rather than conflict. When Alexander eventually suggested formalizing their commitment without contracts or conditions, the moment was quiet and unassuming, not marked by ceremony, but by intention, and Claire agreed not because she needed security, but because she recognized the depth of the choice they were making together. The marriage that followed was modest by design, attended only by those who understood the journey rather than the status, and as they exchanged vows, there was no mention of timelines or terms, only a shared understanding that love was an action practiced daily. In the months that followed, Alexander made deliberate changes within his company, prioritizing transparency and ethical leadership inspired in part by Claire's example. While Claire pursued her own ambitions, supported rather than overshadowed, her voice respected as an equal. Their lives remained busy, filled with responsibilities and challenges, but the foundation they built allowed them to face uncertainty without fear, because they had learned that commitment was not about protection from loss, but about willingness to grow. Looking back, Alexander often reflected on the irony that the arrangement he designed to avoid vulnerability had led him directly into it, teaching him that real security came not from control, but from trust freely given and freely received. Claire, too, recognized that stepping into uncertainty had required courage she did not know she possessed, and that choosing love without guarantees had expanded rather than limited her sense of self. Together, they carried forward the understanding that wealth, status, and contracts could shape circumstances, but only integrity and choice could shape a life worth sharing. And in the quiet moments they shared, away from public eyes and expectations, both knew that the greatest twist was not that a contract had turned into love, but that love had thrived once the contract was gone, proving that the most meaningful commitments are those made without price, without pressure, and without an end date.